Picture this. You're holding a book. The cover is just, it's stark, like almost aggressively high contrast black and white.
Right.
You've got these two figures standing side by side, dressed impeccably in sharp, vintage 1950s clothing.
Oh, yeah, very retro.
Exactly. The man is in a crisp, tailored suit with a striped tie, standing totally rigid. And the woman is wrapped in this bold, glamorous leopard print coat. It looks like an old Hollywood promotional still.
Up until you look at their faces.
Yes. Here is where your stomach just drops.
Yeah.
Where their faces should be, they're wearing these eerie, exaggerated, almost cartoonish skeleton masks. Wide, manic, staring eyes, frozen, grinning teeth.
It's super unsettling.
And the man in the suit, he's holding a stark white folder out toward you, the reader. Printed on that folder in massive, uncompromising black letters is a single word, obey.
It is an incredibly unsettling image to encounter on a bookshelf. I mean, it immediately signals that we are not stepping into a light, casual, or objective sociological history.
Really not.
That cover is designed to provoke an immediate, visceral sense of anxiety. It's basically telling you that the polite society you think you live in is a facade for something far more sinister.
It completely throws you off balance before you even turn to the introduction. And, well, that is the perfect visual entry point for the source material we are diving into today.
It really sets the tone.
It does. The book is called The Future's Assassins, A Century of Cultural Terrorism. It was published in 2026 by an author named Cornelio Munteanu. Our mission for this deep dive is to map out the architecture of the radical, highly controversial worldview presented in these pages. We are going to unpack the specific mechanics of how this author constructs a sprawling, century-long conspiracy theory.
But before we delve into the text itself, we really need to take a moment and speak directly to you, the listener, to establish exactly how we are approaching this material.
We do. This is absolutely crucial for this specific deep dive. This book contains extreme, highly politically charged views.
Very extreme.
It includes content and arguments that are explicitly anti-Semitic, racist, and homophobic. We want to make it unequivocally clear from the outset that we are absolutely not taking sides here.
Right.
Nor are we endorsing, validating, or agreeing with any of the viewpoints, ideologies, or historical interpretations presented by the author.
Exactly. Our role here is strictly as analytical guides. We're treating this text as an artifact in a petri dish.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
We are impartially reporting on its contents to help you understand the specific arguments, the leaps of logic, the selective use of history, and the narrative mechanisms the author uses to construct his worldview.
We're basically looking under the hood.
Right. We are looking at how the argument is built, how the engine of this conspiracy theory actually runs, entirely separate from the validity of the argument itself.
We are putting on our hazmat suits, stepping into the laboratory, and putting this ideological virus under a microscope. So with that framework firmly in place, I want to start with the foundational premise.
Let's do it.
If I had to summarize Munteanu's core thesis, it reads like a total inversion of how most of modern society views the last 100 years of social history.
I mean, inversion is the perfect word for his methodology. Things that mainstream culture generally regards as organic social progress.
Yeah.
You know, the push for political correctness, LGBTQ plus rights, feminism, the civil rights movement, anti-racism.
Yeah.
Munteanu argues that absolutely none of this was organic.
None of it.
He claims it's all part of a coordinated, deliberate, century-long campaign of what he calls cultural terrorism.
He doesn't just suggest these movements had some radical fringes. He asserts that this entire campaign was specifically engineered by a small, elite cabal of Marxist intellectuals.
Well, the very specific goal.
Right, with the explicit singular goal of systematically destroying Western Christian civilization.
It's a massive claim.
It is, but you don't just wake up one day, look out your window, and decide that the entire arc of modern social progress is a manufactured Marxist plot. There has to be a starting point.
Catalyst, yeah.
I was looking through the opening chapters, trying to find his inciting incident. I expected him to start with the fall of the Berlin Wall, or maybe the student riots of 1968. But he doesn't. He starts in a surprisingly mundane place.
Yeah, he begins with a bureaucratic fine levied against an airline in Romania in the year 2005.
Which is such a specific, almost banal, inciting incident. You're telling me the author traces the fall of Western civilization back to an airline ticket.
Well, for Munteanu, it was the loose thread that unraveled the entire sweater. Let's look at the mechanics of this incident.
Okay, lay it out for me.
The Romanian national airline, TAROM, ran a promotional campaign for Valentine's Day and its traditional Romanian equivalent, Dragobete. The promotion offered a special travel discount, but the fine print stated it was exclusively available to heterosexual couples.
A couple's discount, but strictly defined as a man and a woman.
Exactly. So, a Romanian NGO representing the LGBTQ+ community, the Accepti Association, along with a legal resource center, filed a formal complaint.
Which makes sense.
Right. And as a result of that complaint, the National Council for Combating Discrimination, the CNCD, fined Taram 5 million LAN. In 2005 currency conversion, that was a relatively paltry sum.
How much are we talking?
About 138 euros.
Wow.
It was essentially a bureaucratic slap on the wrist. But for Munteanu, this 138 euro fine was an absolute earth-shattering outrage.
Okay, let's unpack this. I've been trying to map this out logically. 138 euros to a national state-backed airline is essentially a rounding error in their catering budget. Why does he dedicate so much space to dissecting a minor administrative penalty?
Because of the precedent he believes it set. Munteanu argues that the traditional holiday of Dragobete has, historically and folklorically, absolutely nothing to do with homosexuality.
Okay.
He dives into the specific traditions of village boys chasing village girls, the celebration of spring, and heterosexual fertility.
Therefore, to him, applying modern anti-discrimination law to this specific ancient cultural tradition is not an act of legal justice.
So what does he call it?
He frames it as an act of state-sanctioned cultural vandalism. So he starts viewing the CNCD, the Discrimination Council, not as a valid constitutional legal body, but as an illegitimate superstate cultural police force.
Exactly. He sees them as agents enforcing a new, invisible totalitarianism upon the traditional majority. He argues that an NGO, an unelected body, essentially used the apparatus of the state to punish a national institution for adhering to the historical norms of the country.
Okay, let me push back on his logic here. One fine against an airline could just be a quirky legal anomaly. It doesn't prove a systemic superstate. How does he build this into a pattern of cultural terrorism?
Well, he layers his evidence. He points to another highly specific incident involving that exact same NGO, the Accepti Association, and the National Blood Supply.
A blood supply?
Yeah. Around 2008, Accepti successfully pushed the Romanian Ministry of Health to remove specific questions from blood donor questionnaires. These were questions that asked prospective donors about homosexual relationships, which the NGO argued were discriminatory and stigmatizing.
And Munteanu frames this administrative change as something incredibly sinister.
He does. He completely ignores the NGO's argument about stigmatization. Instead, he cites statistics regarding HIV infection rates among homosexual men in Western countries to argue that the state yielded to a radical agenda.
He thinks they compromise safety.
Exactly. He claims the government actively prioritized the propaganda and emotional feelings of a tiny minority over the actual biological health and national security of the entire country's blood supply.
He views this as the cultural police actively endangering the physical population just to enforce a progressive ideology. And this fear of ideological enforcement brings us to a massive recurring theme in his work, the policing of language itself.
Oh, he focuses on this a lot.
He is obsessed with how words change over time, and he does not view this evolution as a natural byproduct of empathy.
Right. He traces, for instance, the evolution of how society refers to people with disabilities. He notes the historical shift from using clinical, blunt terms like invalid to the slightly softer handicapped, and eventually to the modern phrase person with special needs.
Most of us looking at that linguistic timeline would say, okay, society is becoming more empathetic. We are trying to define people by their humanity rather than their physical limitations.
But Munteanu views it as a deliberate, malicious impoverishment of language. He argues that by forcing people to use vague, overly broad circumlocutions like person with special needs, a phrase he claims could apply to anyone from someone in a wheelchair to someone simply demanding fringe social acceptance, you are actively dumbing down the population.
It's all about control for him.
Exactly. If you destroy the precision of the language, he argues, you destroy the precision of thought.
It's an interesting, albeit dark, perspective. It's as if the author views societal language not as an organic ecosystem that naturally adapts to its environment, but as a computer's operating system.
That's a great way to think about it.
And he believes this operating system is being maliciously hacked by an outside user with root access. He thinks someone is intentionally rewriting the code with bloated, inefficient software just to make the human machine run slower and become easier to control.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the linguistic hack is central to his theory of control. He compares this new hack to a totalitarianism he and his intended audience already understand intimately: communism. Right. He argues that this new linguistic shift, what we call political correctness, is infinitely more dangerous and insidious than the wooden language forced upon people by the communist regimes of the 20th century.
Let's explore that comparison, because on the surface, living under a dictator like Ceausescu seems vastly more oppressive than being asked to use the term special needs. How does he justify that political correctness is worse than actual historical totalitarianism?
It comes down to the mechanism of compliance. Montiano argues that under Soviet-style communism, the wooden language, the official state slogans, the forced propaganda was imposed entirely from the top down.
People didn't have a choice.
Exactly. People parroted the slogans in public to avoid going to the gulag, but in the privacy of their own kitchens, they knew it was an absolute lie. The mind remained fundamentally free, even if the tongue was captive.
But political correctness, in his view, operates differently.
He argues political correctness is adopted voluntarily. It isn't enforced by secret police dragging you out of your bed.
It's more subtle.
Right. It is enthusiastically pushed by the media, heavily incentivized by universities, adopted by corporate HR departments, and eventually internalized by the masses themselves out of a desire to be seen as good people.
So people police themselves.
They do. It creates a self-policing society where citizens happily put themselves in linguistic straitjackets. To Montiano, this level of voluntary societal subversion, where you eagerly surrender your own precision of thought, couldn't possibly happen by accident.
If you're claiming a hack this massive, a psychological subversion on a global scale, you need a patient zero. You need a hacker. I'm looking through his timeline, and he doesn't point to modern politicians or contemporary activists as the architects. He goes all the way back to the 1920s.
He does.
Walk me through how he bridges that 100-year gap. How does he leap from a 2005 airline fine to post-World War I Europe?
To answer that, Montiano argues we have to look at the greatest failure in Marxist history. We have to go to the chaotic, bloody aftermath of World War I, right after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. This is where he claims the blueprint for the destruction of the West was drafted, born entirely out of intellectual panic.
Okay. Let's set the historical stage here, because this is the foundational bedrock of his entire conspiracy theory. In 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. But according to orthodox Marxist theory, this wasn't really supposed to happen there, right?
Not at all.
Marx predicted that the communist revolution would happen in highly developed, industrialized capitalist countries first. Places like Germany, France, or England.
Yes. Marx's entire economic philosophy was built on the idea that the inherent contradictions of advanced capitalism would inevitably lead the exploited working class, the proletariat, to violently overthrow the bourgeoisie.
But Russia wasn't advanced capitalism.
No, Russia was largely a massive agrarian peasant society. It barely had an industrial working class. But once Lenin and the Bolsheviks took power, the Marxist theorists across Europe waited with bated breath.
Waiting for the dominoes to fall.
Exactly. They assumed Russia was just the spark, and that the highly developed working classes in the West would immediately rise up and join the global revolution.
But they didn't. And Montiano leans heavily on these specific historical failures. He points to the Spartacist uprising in Germany in 1919, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht.
Right.
That was supposed to be the glorious German Revolution, but it was brutally crushed by right-wing paramilitary groups, the Freikorps, who were mostly German war veterans.
It failed entirely.
And then there was the Hungarian Soviet Republic, led by Bela Kun, which collapsed after just 133 days. The grand global working class uprising just fizzled out. The workers, by and large, completely rejected communism.
This is the critical juncture for Montiano's thesis. He asks a very specific question. How did the Marxist intellectuals of the 1920s explain this colossal failure? Why didn't the workers revolt when theory dictated they must?
And what's his answer?
Montiano argues that these theorists realize a fundamental fatal flaw in Marx's original calculus. They realize that economic grievances alone, low wages, terrible working conditions, long hours, were not enough to incite a violent revolution.
Because the working class in the West possessed what Montiano calls an incredibly strong psychological and cultural immune system.
Exactly. He argues that this immune system consisted of two unshakable pillars, their Christian faith and their deep-rooted belief in the traditional patriarchal family.
That makes sense from his perspective.
Montiano posits that the Marxist theorists realized something profound about human nature. As long as a worker believed in God, which gave him hope for justice in the afterlife and a sense of divine order, and as long as he had wife and children to protect and provide for, he would never become a radical, violent revolutionary.
He simply had too much to lose.
Right. And his moral compass was fundamentally opposed to the bloody chaos required for revolution.
So, if I'm understanding the mechanism of Montianu's argument, the Marxists realize the economy is a dead end.
Hmm.
You can't use poverty to destroy the existing order if the poor still believe in God and family. Therefore, they have to shift the target.
They have to pivot entirely from economics to culture.
That is the core of cultural terrorism. He brings up two pivotal figures to illustrate this pivot: Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist, and George Lukács, a Hungarian Marxist philosopher. According to Munteanu, these two men wrote the new playbook for tearing down the West.
They are the key architects for him.
I want to break down Gramsci's contribution first, because his theory of cultural hegemony is still debated in sociology today. But Munteanu uses it as proof of a malicious plot. How does Munteanu define cultural hegemony?
Well, Gramsci argued that the ruling capitalist class maintains its power not just through physical force, the police or the military, but through controlling the cultural narrative.
The ideas.
Yes. They control the church, the schools, the media, the universities. They define what is common sense. Therefore, Gramsci theorized that to overthrow the system, Marxists couldn't just seize the factories in a violent coup.
It wouldn't work.
Right. They had to undertake a long march through the institutions. They had to slowly, methodically infiltrate the culture and dismantle it from the inside out.
It's a fascinating strategic shift. Instead of driving a wrecking ball into the side of the house, which the homeowner will obviously fight to prevent, you introduce termites into the foundation. You let them quietly eat away at the support beams for decades until the house just collapses under its own weight.
A very apt analogy for how Munteanu views the strategy. But, Gramsci was mostly a theoretician writing from a fascist prison cell. Munteanu uses George Lukács to show what this termite strategy actually looked like in practice when given a chance.
Oh, right, the Hungarian experiment.
Yes. During that brief 133-day communist takeover in Hungary in 1919, Lukács was appointed the Deputy Commissar for Culture.
I am really curious about the specifics here. The outline says Lukács instituted radical sex education. But what does radical mean in the context of 1919 Hungary? How did he actually execute this?
Munteanu describes this as a deliberate, calculated experiment in social destruction. Lukács didn't just tweak the curriculum. He implemented a state-mandated program where specialized lecturers were sent into Hungarian public schools.
Into the schools. Oh.
According to the historical accounts Munteanu draws from, these lecturers explicitly taught children about the concepts of free love and the arbitrary nature of sexual morals. They actively mocked the concept of Christian monogamy.
He was using state authority to go directly over the heads of the parents.
He was trying to sever the generational transmission of values. The lecturers encouraged the children to actively rebel against the moral authority of their parents and the local priests. Munteanu argues this wasn't about public health or biology. It was a psychological operation designed to alienate the youth from the traditional family structure. If you can make a child view their parents' morality as oppressive and outdated, you have successfully broken the family unit.
It's the weaponization of teenage rebellion. And you can imagine how conservative Catholic and Protestant parents in 1919 Hungary reacted to state agents telling their children that monogamy is a joke.
The backlash was massive, and it contributed to the rapid collapse of Bela Kun's regime. But Munteanu argues this was the genesis moment. This was the birth of cultural terrorism.
A proof of concept.
Exactly. The strategy was proven. If you can destroy Christianity, capitalism, patriarchy, and the traditional family unit, society will simply collapse on its own, leaving a vacuum for a totalitarian state to fill.
The problem for these theorists was that Hungary and Italy in the 1920s weren't exactly stable laboratories for long-term ideological subversion. The fascists took over Italy and locked Gramsci away. The Hungarian Revolution collapsed, and Lukács had to flee for his life.
They needed a new home.
Right. These European ideas needed a fertile, stable, heavily populated testing ground. And Munteanu claims that testing ground became the United States of America, specifically when a group of these theorists fled the rise of Nazism in the 1930s. He literally refers to this migration as bringing the plague to American shores.
This migration brings us to the central antagonist of Munteanu's narrative, the group he believes executed this cultural terrorism, the Institute for Social Research, far better known as the Frankfurt School.
Now, before we dive into the specific individuals of the Frankfurt School, we must aggressively reiterate the disclaimer we established at the beginning of this deep dive.
Yes, very important.
A recurring, highly charged, and explicit theme in Munteanu's work is his hyper-focus on the Jewish heritage of these specific intellectuals. We are talking about men like Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, Wilhelm Reich, Herbert Marcuse, and Theodor Adorno. Munteanu explicitly frames his narrative around the claim that these men operated primarily as Zionist Jews, whose ultimate underlying loyalty was to a Jewish agenda aimed at subverting and destroying Western Christian society.
It is essential to understand the mechanics of his prejudice here. For Munteanu, their Marxism is almost secondary to their Jewish heritage. He views their complex sociological theories not as genuine philosophical inquiries into the nature of authority or capitalism, but as targeted ethnic warfare designed to break down the cohesion of the Christian majority. We are mapping this author's dark narrative architecture, and this anti-Semitic framing is the mortar holding his entire conspiracy theory together.
It's the filter through which he views every piece of their work. So let's look at how he breaks down the specific weapons forged by these theorists, starting with Erich Fromm. Fromm was a psychoanalyst and sociologist. How does Munteanu frame his contribution to the destruction of the West?
Well, Munteanu focuses heavily on Fromm's Marxist critique of Christianity. Fromm essentially argued that religion operates as a psychological pacifier for the oppressed masses.
Like a coping mechanism.
Yes, in a brutal capitalist system that denies people real material satisfaction, autonomy, and agency, religion offers a spiritual substitute. It teaches resignation. It teaches obedience to authority in this life, in exchange for the promise of a glorious reward in the afterlife.
It's a psychoanalytical update to Marx's classic "religion is the opiate of the masses" argument.
Yes, but Munteanu views this not as a sociological observation, but as a deliberate, targeted psychological assault on the bedrock of Western morality. By pathologizing faith, by reducing the profound historical spiritual experience of Christianity to a mere psychological coping mechanism for economic anxiety, Munteanu argues that Fromm was actively trying to destroy the spiritual anchor that kept the Western working class stable and resilient.
He's arguing Fromm was trying to take away the workers' emotional armor, but, I mean, Fromm is relatively tame, almost academic compared to the next figure on Munteanu's list. I was reading the section on Wilhelm Reich, and I had to put the book down for a minute because it is incredibly bizarre.
It really is.
How does Reich fit into this plot?
Wilhelm Reich is perhaps the most colorful, radical, and ultimately tragic figure in the Frankfurt School orbit. Munteanu attributes a massive amount of the blame for modern societal decay directly to him.
What was his theory?
Reich attempted to synthesize Sigmund Freud's theories of psychoanalysis and repressed sexuality with Karl Marx's theories of economic oppression. He created what he called sex economy.
Break down the mechanics of sex economy for us. How does sexual repression lead to economic or political oppression?
Reich essentially argued that the strict, traditional Christian patriarchal family is a literal factory for creating authoritarian citizens.
A factory.
Yeah. He claimed that when a rigid father figure sexually represses a child, instilling deep shame, guilt, and fear around natural sexual impulses from a very young age, that repressed sexual energy doesn't just disappear.
It has to go somewhere.
Exactly. It ferments.
Yeah.
It turns into neurosis, anxiety, and a deep psychological craving for external validation and a strong authoritarian leader to tell them what to do. Reich literally claimed that the patriarchal family creates the psychology of fascism.
So if you are raised in a strict, traditional home, you are psychologically primed to embrace a dictator. That is a massive claim.
And Munteanu sees this theory as the ultimate Trojan horse. By equating the traditional Christian family with the genesis of fascism, Reich was providing the intellectual justification for dismantling the family unit entirely.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. Munteanu argues that Reich wanted to separate children from the moral authority of their parents, handing their education and psychological development over to the state. He wanted to encourage early, completely uninhibited sexual activity to prevent them from developing conservative, traditional values.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because Reich didn't stop at sociological theory, he went entirely off the deep end into what can only be described as pseudoscience. He claimed to have discovered a literal, physical, cosmic, sexual energy that he called orgone.
Yes, orgone energy.
Mm-hmm.
He believed this was the vital, biological life force of the universe, essentially a physically quantifiable version of Freud's libido. You could measure it in the atmosphere.
Measure it.
Yeah. And he believed that a lack of orgone energy caused by sexual repression was the root cause of all physical and mental illnesses, including cancer.
And he built machines to harvest it. I couldn't believe this part. He built these devices called orgone accumulators. They were essentially human-sized boxes, like phone booths or Faraday cages, made of alternating layers of organic material like wood or wool, and metal like steel wool.
It's wild.
You were supposed to sit naked inside these boxes to absorb this cosmic sexual energy and cure your neuroses. And he actually convinced intelligent, famous people to buy them. Sean Connery apparently used one. J.D. Salinger was interested in them.
It sounds utterly absurd to us now, but it had very real severe legal consequences.
What happened?
The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, eventually investigated Reich. They declared his orgone accumulators to be a medical fraud of the first magnitude. They secured an injunction against him.
And he didn't listen.
No, when Reich violated that injunction regarding the interstate transport of his devices and literature, he was tried, convicted of contempt, and sent to federal prison.
And the FDA didn't just lock him up. They actually ordered the destruction of his accumulators and the physical burning of his books, research journals, and publications. Munteanu points out that this was one of the largest state-sponsored book burnings in American history, carried out by the American government in the 1950s.
Wow.
Reich died in prison of a heart attack shortly after.
Munteanu uses Reich's tragic, bizarre end to paint a very complex narrative picture. On one hand, he sees Reich as a dangerous madman whose theories on sexual liberation laid the necessary groundwork for the destruction of the family.
But on the other hand,
He points out that burning the books didn't kill the idea. He notes how deeply Reich's book, The Sexual Revolution, influenced the radical youth of the 1960s. The ideas survived the incinerator.
which transitions us to the man Munteanu views as the guru of that 1960s youth movement, Herbert Marcuse. If Reich provided the chaotic theory of sexual liberation, Marcuse took those theories, refined them, and weaponized them for a new generation.
Marcuse is widely famous for coining the phrase, "make love, not war." Munteanu views him as a professional, dedicated revolutionary who looked at the landscape of post-World War II America and realized that Marx's original working class was a completely lost cause.
Because in the 1950s and 60s, the American working class was experiencing an unprecedented economic boom.
Precisely. The working class had become what Marcuse called bourgeoisified. They owned homes in the suburbs, they had cars in the driveway, they had televisions, they had stable pensions. They were completely materially comfortable.
They weren't angry anymore.
Right. Munteanu argues that Marcuse understood a fundamental truth. You cannot incite a violent, system-destroying revolution with a population that is comfortable and heavily invested in the status quo.
So if the blue-collar workers won't fight the capitalist system because they are enjoying the fruits of it, Marcuse needed to find a new army. He needed a new revolutionary vanguard. I'm looking at how Munteanu describes this shift, and he claims Marcuse explicitly identified a coalition of the aggrieved to tear down society.
Yes. Munteanu argues Marcuse explicitly identified this new army, radicalized university students, militant feminists, aggrieved racial minorities, and the emerging homosexual rights movement.
He argues Marcuse synthesized the disparate grievances of these minority groups, uniting them under a single overarching narrative.
A narrative of systemic oppression. He taught them that they were all victims of the same enemy, the white, Christian, capitalist, patriarchal majority. Marcuse wasn't interested in fixing the system or achieving incremental legislative equality.
What did he want?
Munteanu argues he wanted to instigate a diffuse and dispersive disintegration of the system. He wanted total chaos. He used the student protests against the Vietnam War and the civil rights struggles not as organic moral movements for justice, but as cynical wedges to crack American society apart at the seams.
It's a breathtakingly cynical interpretation of the entire 1960s counterculture. He strips away any genuine desire for peace or equality and replaces it with pure, malicious subversion.
It really is.
But Munteanu argues that the most insidious weapon forged by the Frankfurt School wasn't just protest movements or sexual liberation. It was the psychological pathologizing of normal, traditional people. And this brings us to a massive section of the book, Theodor Adorno and his 1949 sociological study, The Authoritarian Personality.
This book is a crucial pillar of Munteanu's argument. Adorno and his team of researchers attempted to create a quantitative sociological metric to measure an individual's potential for fascism. They called it the F scale, F for fascism.
Okay, so a test for fascism.
Yes. They conducted extensive clinical interviews, thematic apperception tests, and questionnaires, operating on the premise that the horrors of Nazi Germany showed that certain personality types were psychologically predisposed to authoritarian, anti-democratic, and highly prejudiced behavior.
I want to dig into the methodology of this F scale, because Munteanu spends an inordinate amount of time dissecting it. What kind of questions were Adorno's team actually asking people in 1949 to determine if they were latent fascists?
Well, the F-scale measured things like conventionalism, rigid adherence to traditional middle-class values.
Huh?
It measured authoritarian submission, a submissive, uncritical attitude toward idealized moral authorities of the in-group.
Okay.
It asked questions like whether obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. It measured anti-interception, which is an opposition to the subjective, the imaginative, or the tender-minded.
So if you were a strict parent who believed in firm discipline, hard work, and traditional gender roles, the F scale was designed to flag you as a potential risk to democracy.
That is exactly how Montiano interprets it. And to prove that the study was rigged, Montiano aggressively dissects the source data, specifically the clinical interviews with two college students who were given the pseudonyms Mac and Larry.
Oh, this part.
Yeah, this part of Montiano's book is frankly jarring to read because he spends pages fiercely defending Mac.
Let's break down the Mac and Larry interviews, because this is where the mechanics of Montiano's anti-Semitism become glaringly overt. How did Adorno's team classify these two students?
Adorno's team classified Mac as highly ethnocentric. He scored very high on the F scale, marking him as possessing an authoritarian personality, a potential fascist.
And why was that?
Because during his deep dive clinical interview, Mac expressed a distinct, virulent dislike for Jews. He stated they were clannish, overly materialistic, that they manipulated businesses, and that Jewish immigrants should be prevented from entering the country and instead forced to fully assimilate and abandon their culture.
Basically repeating standard anti-Semitic tropes. Meanwhile, how did Larry score?
Larry scored low on the F scale. Larry was described as focused on making money, wanted to travel, expressed general support for equal rights for Black Americans, and didn't seem to harbor deep prejudices against Jews. He noted only a generalized societal fear of their business acumen, but rejected organized anti-Semitism. Adorno classified Larry as a tolerant, democratic personality type.
Okay, I'm trying to map Montiano's logic here. How on earth does he look at Mac, a guy spouting literal anti-Semitic tropes in a post-WWII study, and defend him as the hero of this scenario?
Montiano vehemently attacks Adorno's methodology by validating Mac's prejudice. He argues that Mac's anti-Semitic statements were not signs of a latent pathological fascist illness, but rather the rational, objective, and historically accurate observations of a clear-sighted traditional American protecting his culture.
Wow.
Yeah. Montiano defends Mac's bigotry by citing his own long lists of historical grievances against Jewish people, essentially arguing Mac wasn't crazy, he was right.
He takes a 1949 sociological study and argues that it wasn't science at all. He's claiming the entire F-scale was a deliberate ideological weapon designed to criminalize any defense of traditional majority culture.
He argues that Adorno rigged the F-scale from the start. He claims that Adorno defined fascism as any adherence to traditional Christian values, any expression of national pride, or any resistance to the integration of minority groups, specifically Jewish groups.
So if you're traditional, you're sick.
Exactly. By slapping the clinical label of authoritarian personality on someone like Mac, Adorno was creating a pseudo-scientific justification to declare traditional conservative people as mentally ill.
He argues that the F-scale is the intellectual grandfather of modern cancel culture. If you disagree with the new progressive orthodoxy, you aren't just holding a different political opinion, you are psychologically defective. You are a phobe, homophobic, xenophobic, transphobic. You have a sickness that needs to be cured or quarantined.
And Montiano argues that this is exactly how political correctness operates globally today. It is the weaponization of psychology to silence the majority by making them fear being labeled as mentally or morally defective.
Okay, we've mapped out the massive intellectual theories of the Frankfurt School. We have Gramsci's termite strategy of cultural hegemony, Reich's sexual revolution destroying the family, Marcuse's coalition of aggrieved minorities, and Adorno's psychological weaponization of the F-scale. But I have a major problem with this timeline.
What's that?
Theories in a book are one thing. You can't destroy a global civilization just by publishing dense, unreadable sociological papers in academic journals. How did these theories actually reach the mainstream? How did they alter the physical behavior of millions of ordinary people? This moves us to Montiano's highly mechanical explanation of the sexual revolution.
Yes, Montiano makes a surprising, strictly biological historical argument here. He completely rejects the popular narrative that the sexual revolution started in the 1960s with rock and roll, Woodstock, the Beatles, and the hippie movement.
If not the 60s, then when?
He argues it actually started 2 decades earlier during the global trauma of World War II and was driven entirely by medical technology.
He points to two specific scientific advancements that he claims fundamentally altered human behavior on a species level. The first is penicillin.
We have to remember the context of the world before the widespread use of penicillin in the 1940s. Contracting a sexually transmitted disease, specifically syphilis, was a terrifying prospect.
It was basically a death sentence.
Often a slow, agonizing one, leading to madness, neurological collapse, and physical decay. Munteanu points out that historical figures like Al Capone and, ironically, Wilhelm Reich himself suffered the ravages of it. Syphilis functioned as a severe biological deterrent against promiscuity. The fear of death kept people monogamous.
It was nature's ultimate punishment for straying outside the marriage bed. But when penicillin was mass-produced for the troops in WWII, it essentially cured syphilis overnight. It removed the biological punishment and the visceral existential fear associated with extramarital sex. The risk factor of promiscuity plummeted.
And then, the second advancement drops in 1960, the oral contraceptive pill. If penicillin removed the fear of disease, the pill fundamentally severed the biological act of sex from the consequence of reproduction.
That's a massive shift.
Huge. It gave women, for the first time in human history, nearly total chemical control over their fertility.
I'm looking at how Munteanu processes these facts, and it's fascinating because he doesn't deny the science. He takes standard historical facts that medical advancements radically change social behavior and tightly wraps his conspiracy theory around them.
Right.
He acknowledges that the Frankfurt School theorists didn't invent the human desire for sex, nor did they sit in a lab and invent penicillin or the pill. They aren't cartoon villains inventing mind control rays.
But what's fascinating here is that Munteanu argues that these intellectuals maliciously weaponized these medical advancements. They saw that science had removed the natural historical barriers to promiscuity. They realized humanity was suddenly biologically untethered.
They saw an opportunity.
Exactly. And instead of reinforcing moral boundaries, they actively promoted a culture of total sexual liberation through the media and academia to exploit that new vulnerability.
Let me try to put this into an analogy to see if I have his logic right. It's like the author believes these intellectuals saw a massive crack forming in the town dam caused of the shifting tectonic plates of medical science.
Okay, I like this.
But instead of warning the town or trying to patch the crack, they handed everyone in town pickaxes and said, "Swinging these is liberating, break it down." They wanted the flood to wash away the town.
That is a perfect summation of his worldview. Munteanu believes that by actively promoting promiscuity as freedom, normalizing divorce as self-actualization, and pushing for abortion access as health care, these cultural terrorists successfully shattered the traditional patriarchal family.
And what's the end goal there?
Once the family unit is broken, the children are left vulnerable, easily indoctrinated by the state, the schools, and the media into the new Marxist orthodoxy, without parents there to provide a counter-narrative.
He connects the dots of destruction very neatly. But Munteanu takes this argument to an incredibly dark, almost fatalistic conclusion when he discusses the HIV/AIDS epidemic that exploded in the 1980s. He does not view AIDS as a tragic, unforeseen public health crisis.
No, not at all. He views the AIDS epidemic almost as the inevitable, mathematically certain and destructive culmination of the Frankfurt School's push for total sexual liberation.
Wow.
He heavily emphasizes the early demographic statistics of the epidemic, focusing almost exclusively on the high transmission rates among homosexual men in the West during the early 1980s.
He uses the devastation of the AIDS crisis to retroactively validate his claim that the sexual revolution was never about human freedom. He argues it was always a biological blueprint for civilizational death.
The leaps in logic are staggering.
Yeah.
He takes the biological reality of a tragic viral mutation and frames it as the intentional endgame of a 1920s Marxist sociological theory. He essentially argues they told you to abandon Christian morality and the result was a plague.
But the author doesn't stop at weaponizing sex and disease. You noted earlier that Marcuse's new revolutionary vanguard included aggrieved racial minorities, and this leads us to what is arguably the most controversial, historically revisionist section of the entire book, his analysis of the American Black Civil Rights Movement, spanning from roughly 1955 to 1968.
Munteanu presents an incredibly dismissive take on this era. He argues that for the half-century prior to the bus boycotts and the marches, the black population in America was largely content.
Content.
Yeah, he completely, astonishingly dismisses the organic reality of Jim Crow laws.
Let me jump in here because this is where his methodology just falls apart if you scrutinize it. I mean, if you were writing a history of the 20th century, how do you mathematically bypass the entire legal structure of Jim Crow?
You really can't.
Right. How does he ignore the documented history of lynchings, systemic disenfranchisement, and racial terror to claim a demographic was content? Does he just ignore the primary sources?
He bypasses it by claiming that the sudden explosion of civil disobedience, the boycotts in Montgomery, the marches in Selma, and the subsequent urban riots were not organic responses to those conditions. He claims they were entirely manufactured by outside agitators who whipped up a frenzy where none naturally existed.
Manufactured by who? Who does he claim had the power to invent a nationwide civil rights movement?
He points the finger right back to the Jewish Marxist elites. He claims that these intellectuals heavily infiltrated, funded, and manipulated black civil rights organizations. He specifically targets the NAACP, noting the Jewish heritage of some of its early founders and legal strategists.
So he strips the agency away from millions of black Americans fighting for basic human dignity, reducing them to mere pawns, foot soldiers in a Marxist war against the white establishment.
According to his narrative, the Marxists didn't care about black equality. They simply used the legitimate historical grievances of the black population as a battering ram to weaken Christian capitalist America.
Unbelievable.
And to justify his overarching view that racial integration itself is inherently unnatural and forced, he reaches far back into American history. He quotes Abraham Lincoln, specifically an address Lincoln gave in August of 1862.
I want to break down this Lincoln quote because it shows how Montianu cherry-picks history to serve his conspiracy. What is the context of the 1862 meeting?
Well, Lincoln invited a delegation of prominent free black men to the White House. It was the first time a president had done so. The Civil War is raging, emancipation is on the horizon, and Lincoln is struggling with the immense, unprecedented complexities of how a post-slavery biracial society would function.
It was a very tense time.
Extremely. During this meeting, Lincoln explicitly suggests that the physical differences between the races are a great disadvantage to us both. He tells them that white people will never accept them as equals, and he actively advocates for the colonization or physical separation of the races by suggesting freed slaves should move to a colony in Central America or Africa.
It's a bleak, historically accurate moment that shows Lincoln's own deep prejudices and political fears at the time. But how does Montianu use this historical artifact?
Montianu uses this quote from a president in 1862 to argue that if the great emancipator himself believed that the races could not coexist peacefully, then modern racial integration must be a forced, unnatural state of affairs.
He ignores everything that happened after.
Exactly.
Right.
He strips away the 160 years of subsequent history, the 14th Amendment, the end of segregation, the success of a multiracial democracy, and says, look, even Lincoln knew it wouldn't work.
If we trace this back to the core of Montianu's thesis, he views the civil rights movement identically to how he views the sexual revolution. He absolutely refuses to see it as an organic, moral demand for human equality under the law.
He can't. It ruins his theory.
Right. He views it purely as a cynical, engineered wedge driven deep into the heart of American society by his imagined cabal. The goal wasn't to secure voting rights or end segregation. The goal was to create insurmountable racial tension, to cause riots, to cause chaos, and to ultimately topple the existing power structure of Western civilization.
It is an all-consuming framework. Everything is connected. Every social change, every medical advancement, every plea for equality, every shift in vocabulary is just another gear in this massive, invisible machine designed to destroy the traditional world.
It is an exhausting, suffocating worldview to inhabit. Which brings us to the end of our deep dive, and the need to step back and look at the entire narrative architecture we've just spent the last hour mapping out.
It's a lot to process.
It really is. We've seen how Montianu takes genuine historical anxieties, the rapid, confusing changes in language, the deep trauma of shifting gender roles and family structures, the complexities of medical advancements altering human behavior, and the turbulence of civil rights struggles.
He takes all the messy, chaotic reality of the 20th century, the millions of intersecting variables that make up human history, and he neatly packages it into a single, overarching conspiracy controlled by a specific cabal of Jewish intellectuals.
And for you, the listener, who is trying to make sense of a world that often feels like it's spinning faster than any of us can comprehend, We dissected this text today not to validate its deeply flawed claims, but to show exactly how a polemic like this operates. We want to show you the gears turning inside the machine.
Because a book like The Future's Assassins offers its readers a very specific, albeit incredibly dark, kind of psychological comfort. It offers the illusion of control.
Comfort in a weird way, yeah.
It tells the reader that the chaos of modernity isn't just the messy, unpredictable collision of history, economics, and technology. It promises that there is a villainous plot. And if there is a plot, there is a clear enemy. And a clear enemy with a face and a name is much easier to process than the terrifying, indifferent randomness of historical change.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering question to mull over as we wrap up. If conspiracy theories like this thrive because they offer simple, human scapegoats for complex, systemic change is what happens to our society when the pace of technological and social change accelerates even further beyond our comprehension.
That's the real concern.
As AI, biotechnology, and global interconnectedness fundamentally rewire our reality in the next decade, do we learn to accept the chaos and nuance of a changing world? Or do the conspiracy theories just get darker, more elaborate, and more dangerous?
It is a question of whether we as a society choose to do the difficult work of understanding the nuance, or if we surrender to the easy comfort of putting on the skeleton mask.
Stay insanely curious, everyone. Keep questioning the narratives you encounter. Look beneath the surface, demand the primary sources, and don't be afraid of the complexity. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.